Hey all, thanks so much for joining me. If you haven't yet, please introduce yourself in the chat and share your role, agency, and location. It's wonderful to see folks from all across the country. I'm seeing university folks, juvenile court, victim advocates, um, interns, seasoned professionals, really a whole range of folks. So thank you all so much for the work that you do and for taking some time to learn more about stalking today. So my name is Dana Flightman. I am the Senior Training and Awareness Specialist at Spark, the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. And I do training on stalking all across the country for audiences like yourselves, including victim services as well as criminal justice folks. So lots of victim advocates, university professionals, law enforcement, prosecutors, really anyone on the victim service or criminal justice side of recognizing and responding to stalking. And I usually start by asking this question, which I'm going to launch here as a poll. And that's, have you had the opportunity to attend a training before, specifically on the topic of stalking? So, not one where stalking was mentioned, but one that was like, we're actually just going to sit down and talk stalking today. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer that there. All right. And so I'm shutting it down in three, two, one. Great. So it looks like we have a mix of folks. We have some saying about a third saying, "Oh, I've been to several of these. I could teach this." And if that's you, of course, there's no one expert on stalking. I don't claim to be that. So please don't hesitate to share in the chat your examples, what's working, what's not working, your insights, your expertise, because y'all are the ones actually on the ground doing this work every day. I'm seeing about a third saying maybe one or two, and over a third saying, "Ooh, this is my first one." And not that you aren't special, as you are, but that is fairly typical. Actually, often a third to a half to sometimes the whole room have never had the chance to attend stalking training before. And that's not a reflection on anyone as a professional, but it is a reflection that stalking is very undertrained in our field. And we want to remember there are four major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking, but it's always kind of like and stalking. Like we almost called our website andstalking.org, because so often it's like, oh yeah, and stalking. It's kind of in the mix. It's something that we do too. But the reality is that stalking is a prevalent standalone victimization as well as one that often intersects with intimate partner and sexual violence. It's criminal, it's traumatic and dangerous, but it's very under-resourced. When you think about it, there is no national stalking hotline. There are few, if any, stalking crisis centers. And so it often falls to folks like you who are generally primarily focused on and have a lot more resources around intimate partner and sexual violence to kind of add stalking on. And I'm not saying that's fair or easy because y'all are already busy and have plenty of work to do. But it is really important because these stalking survivors really have nowhere else to go. So, like I said, you're the ones on the ground every day doing the work. You already know how to do what you do. My hope's just by the end of the session, you kind of move that and stalking a little more to the beginning of the sentence and see some of the critical work that you're already doing through that lens with some new tools, frameworks, ideas, and resources. So, Spark is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. We are the technical assistance provider on stalking, which is a fancy way of saying that we're here to help the helpers and y'all are the helpers. And so, if you are working with a stalking survivor and would like to talk it through with somebody, you can give us a call. We can offer that individualized help. If you want further training on stalking or a resource not on our website, just reach out. We're usually free of charge and we can make it for you. Our website is stalkingawareness.org, and my colleague Emma is on to share some resources I mentioned today. But all of those will be available on the website. There we have a ton of resources. We have practitioner guides, and those are broken out by discipline. So we have a section for victim services, for law enforcement, for prosecution, for healthcare professionals, and so on. Um, Everything from really robust guides that are long on specific topics, like, say, integrating a stalking response into supervised visitation and exchange programs, as well as one-pagers, infographics, fact sheets, and things like that. We have training modules. So if you or anyone at your agency does any kind of awareness education, if you're doing something for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, if you're talking consent, you're talking bystander, you're talking healthy relationships, you want to be talking stalking as well. And so we have programs on our website that are kind of ready to go that you can pick up and lead with scripts and slides and videos and activities. We also have discussion guides on every season of the TV show You on Netflix, as well as an overall guide now that it's over, and lots of ways to get folks talking stalking without you having to reinvent the wheel. We have victim resources, so we're not a direct service provider, so please don't refer victims to Spark for anything other than information that's general and available because we'll just have to be nice and send them back to somewhere local. But we do have a lot of resources that you can share with victims easily. For example, we have these brochures that you can order from our website in English and Spanish on understanding stalking, and you can put your local agency information here. So if you have something to share with your survivor of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, make sure you have something for your stalking survivor as well. We also have documentation logs, a handbook available in 10 different languages, and a lot of other resources, and webinars like this one. So if after today you're like, I wish I could hear Dana talk even more. You are in luck, my friends, because we have an archive of recorded webinars and we're called Spark. So I got us to call it the Sparchives. So that was like the height of my career. So you can check us out on the Sparchives anytime. We're also on social media. Our handle on there is at Follow Us Legally. If you get our sick sense of humor at Spark, we want you to follow us. It's actually a positive thing. It's consensual. And sign up for our newsletter. As an anti-stalking organization, we will not contact you excessively or without your consent. So you have to actually opt into our newsletter. And it's one we send around quarterly. It's not one of those you're getting all the time. So I really hope that you will connect with us. All right, so why learn about stalking? Well, stalking is a really important thing to understand. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So, stalking is criminal. It's a crime at the federal level in all 50 states and every territory, as including the District of Columbia. It's a crime on most tribal lands and the military justice system. For university folks, it's also going to violate your student conduct policies and often falls under Title IX and is a reportable offense under the Clery Act. So, depending where you're located, it might be a misdemeanor or it might be a felony, but it is a crime across the board. A lot of folks don't realize that stalking's actually criminal. So you have a lot of victims who are thinking, well, what, should I call the police because somebody's texting me or coming to my home? And of course, a lot goes into a victim's decision to engage with law enforcement or not. But a lot of folks don't even realize that's an option because they don't recognize what's happening is stalking, and further, that stalking is a crime. Now, of course, every state and territory has their own stalking statute, and that can get quite confusing. And so I encourage you to check out on our website. We have a map with every stalking statute. So you can click on where you're located or where you're interested in, and you can download the statute as well as some interpretation from our attorneys at Equitas. And so it's definitely good to know both the behavioral definition and your specific statute, and also to recognize the jurisdictional issues that can come up, right? So, you cross stalking often involves following. So you cross that state line, you might be looking at two different statutes, and the jurisdictional issues there. So, stalking is a crime, it is criminal, and it is traumatic. Many stalking victims experience mental as well as physical health issues that can be short-term to lifelong, particularly post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. And actually, in our new project, Vital Signs, which is focusing on addressing stalking in healthcare settings, we're finding that stalking is correlated with physical health symptoms as well, including heart disease and other chronic illnesses. And I think what's perhaps a bit unique to stalking is that sense of anticipatory fear, that sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And we have stalking survivors feel like that sometimes for years. And so you can imagine the kind of chronic stress that creates and the kind of hypervigilance that often results. Many lose time from work, 1 in 8 lose some time, about half of those lose 5 days or more. And stalking survivors are not always a protected class of worker, so they might lose their job entirely. And many relocate. This really shocked me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move. So think how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? Even if you're excited about moving, it's stressful, it's expensive. It's not something you do because someone's kind of bothering you. We have 1 in 7 victims relocating to get away from these offenders, which I think helps to illustrate how consuming and traumatic this victimization can be. Always good to hear from survivors in their own words. Here's one who said, "It's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there." And I like this quote because it illustrates what so many stalking survivors have said to me, that sense of it's never really over, that I knew the day probation or parole ended, they'd call me, and they did. That, oh, my birthday's coming up, I'm going to get a creepy card in the mail, and they do. That sense of rather than it being a traumatic event they can heal from over time, this person can always come back and might even escalate, and that it's never truly over. And stalking is dangerous. It often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including but not limited to rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or to directly harm their victims, and in 76% of intimate partner femicides, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking, the year prior to that homicide or attempted homicide. And yet, so often these stalking behaviors are dismissed and minimized as, oh, it's texting, it's following, it's annoying, but no one's really getting hurt here. And that's simply not true. In fact, this wonderful researcher we work with, Patrick Brady, went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. These behaviors and tactics adding up and escalating over time. Now, I'm not saying every stalking case escalates to the point of homicide, right? That's not accurate. What I am saying is that every week I read cases of homicide or attempted homicide, violence or attempted violence, and at that point, often responders start looking backwards and saying, oh, look, there's this whole history of stalking victimization here. Often that was reported, but was not handled with the urgency needed. So we don't want to do that, right? We don't want to wait for violence and then say, oh, there was stalking all along. No, we want to identify the stalking while it's happening and intervene then, because this is one of the few victimizations where early identification and intervention can help prevent further trauma, violence, possibly even homicide. But like intimate partner and sexual violence, it's quite underreported, right? So, of course, it always depends what study you look at, but fewer than a third of our stalking victims are reporting to law enforcement, and even fewer are going to victim services. So, you can tell me in the chat why. Why wouldn't a stalking victim reach out for help the moment they start thinking, huh, I'm getting a little scared here? Any ideas? They don't know it's stalking at first. Yeah, they may not identify what's going on. And then even if they think it's stalking, they may not realize that's a crime that's worth reporting. No one will believe them. Yeah, there's often that fear that the responder will not believe them, that they will say, and or that they'll really minimize it, right? And that normalization of stalking behavior, absolutely. So that, you're overreacting. Are you sure they meant it that way? It's probably not that big a deal. And that not believing it themselves, they think they're overreacting. Yeah, absolutely. Because of the messages our victims have received, often they do that minimization as well. And there's that sense of like, I don't want to make it a whole thing. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I'm being over dramatic, right? And so, absolutely, there's that fear the responder will do that and victims doing that themselves. Absolutely. Um, and on that not being believed, yeah, that they, um, yes, that fear and how can you prove it? Yeah, absolutely. We know that with stalking, victims are often kind of expected to save their own evidence, right? And so if we have a stalking survivor, we're like, great, show me your documentation log. And look, we love to see it. It's helpful. We have it on our website in 10 languages, but it's quite burdensome for victims. For a lot of victims, if they get, say, an upsetting text message, their instinct might be to delete it, not to save it, right? Because they don't want to think about it every time they look at their phone. And so, of course, we want to encourage our victims to save evidence, but they might feel like, yeah, this happened, but I can't prove it. What's the point even coming in? Yeah, they might have had a negative experience with law enforcement in the past, or have a friend who has and just not feel that they'll be able to do anything. No consistency with support. Yeah, there's that sense of there's nothing they can do, and or there's nothing they will do, which are similar but a little bit different. As well as that, yeah, fear of the escalation, right? That we know if they do report, the stalker might escalate their behavior. How dare you get me in trouble? That could actually increase the risk to the victim. So for all those and more reasons, we see that most victims do not report, right? But let's say they do report. So this was a study in the state of Colorado. About 1,800 cases of domestic violence, about 300 involve clear documented evidence of stalking in law enforcement hands. So that doesn't usually happen for all the reasons we just said, right? But here we have 298 cases with that evidence of stalking that meets the statute. How many cases do you think were charged as stalking, like got a stalking charge? It was one. Only one case was charged as stalking. And look, stalking's not always the most strategic charge. I understand that, but it's also not never the most strategic charge. And absolutely, it's underreported. But even when it is reported, even when there is sufficient evidence, we see that our offenders are not being held accountable, and that our law enforcement officers are not necessarily looking at criminal behavior through the lens of stalking, and again, holding these stalkers accountable. But our victim services are not off the hook either, because even fewer victims are seeking victim services than going to law enforcement. And of that 16% who sought help, 1 in 4 didn't receive any help. So what's going on there? I don't think it's evil victim services like trying to send people away, but it can be really hard to know where to go for help as a stalking survivor, right? Because again, there's no stalking crisis center. And especially if you're being stalked by someone who's not an intimate partner, say a neighbor or an estranged family member or an old friend, right? Why would it occur to you to look up like domestic violence services and your area code? Like that's not very intuitive. And yet that's where the folks like you are often housed who can help, right? Who can give them those services that they might need. And so they might walk in the wrong door, and the folks who are there may not have the resources, training capacity to be helping those stalking survivors. That being said, realize that if you receive federal funding, you are required to serve all victims of stalking, intimate partner and not. So we try to provide tools and resources to make that possible. But that's not something that a lot of folks know. And so our stalking survivors often end up not really sure where to go and not able to get the help that they need. And so, big picture, we have this serious victimization. Our offenders are not being held accountable. Our victims are not getting help. But it's okay. We're going to fix it today. So, today I'm going to talk about what is stalking, look at the behavioral definition, some dynamics and prevalence, the diversity of stalking behaviors. I'll touch briefly on the intersection of stalking with intimate partner and sexual violence, and then some very big picture tips on responding to victims. All right, so what is stalking? I keep saying it's so bad we have to do something. Um, well, it depends who you ask. Are we talking about the behavioral definition? Are we talking about the statutes, which I already mentioned vary, right? Or are we talking about a certain organization's policy? I'm focusing on the behavioral definition today. One, because this is a national webinar and folks have different statutes. And also because regardless of what your statute says, you want to know when stalking behavior is happening. Because even if it's not going to be charged and the victim's not going through the criminal justice system, or they are, there's no stalking charge or whatever, you still want to know when stalking's happening so that you can name the behavior accurately and connect them to the right resources and recognize the risks that they're experiencing, right? So we want to name it so we can safety plan with the right urgency and tools appropriately. So I have these 3 scenarios for you, and all of these are bummers. Okay, we don't like any of them, but which of them are stalking? It could be all of them, some of them, none of them. So I'm going to go ahead and launch them each as a poll. So here's the first one. A student peeks in the women's locker room to watch the women in their undress. Does that sound like stalking to you? Yes or no? All right, results are coming in. I'm shutting it down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and poll. Share results. Okay, so pretty split. Most folks saying no, but closer to 50-50. I hope we can get along after this, okay? Some disagreement here. Okay, how about this second scenario? An ex-partner repeatedly spreads vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. Does that sound like stalking to you? All right, another nail biter, y'all. All right, I'm shutting it down in five, four, three, two, one. Okay, and it looks like most folks saying yes, but closer to a 60-40 split, so also quite divided. Okay, and last but not least, you have this terrible supervisor regularly asking her employee personal questions, mocking him in meetings, sending emails at weird hours, being verbally abusive when he doesn't respond right away. Does that sound like stalking to you? All right, I'm shutting it down in five, four, three, two, one. Okay. Another room split here. A few more saying yes than no, but also all of these pretty even, right? So thanks for doing that. A couple things might have come up for you when you had to make these snap judgments, right? You might have been thinking, well, I need more information, right? Like what else was going on, or how did the victim feel about it, or how many times did this happen? And so luckily for you, I'm going to go through the behavioral definition and I'll use these examples in there to help explain it. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their safety or the safety of others, or to suffer substantial emotional distress. So to break that down a little bit, okay, it is a pattern of behavior, not a single incident or one-off event. And that's called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So you might hear me use those terms kind of interchangeably today, pattern of behavior, course of conduct. I'm talking about the same thing. It's two or more behaviors that make up that pattern. There are a couple of states that require three or more, but behaviorally and in most places, it's two or more. And those behaviors can be quite varied. So let's say I'm stalking you because I'm the worst presenter ever. Okay. So maybe Monday I text you, Tuesday I'm mad you didn't respond, so I smash your headlights. Then Wednesday I feel kind of bad about that, so I send you flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors, right? And so stalkers often combine behaviors that are crimes on their own, like that property damage, with other behaviors that may not be criminal on their own, but can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. So that's confusing because it's not a crime to send flowers or to text somebody, but it is a crime to stalk somebody. It's also confusing because our system tends to be pretty incident based. Our officers are responding to a call for service. And for victim services, our victim might be talking about the event that brought them in that day. And so I encourage you, whenever a victim's telling you about an upsetting incident, to zoom out. Is this an isolated incident? Is it part of a bigger course of conduct? Because your victim who's telling you about, say, their smashed headlight may or may not think to automatically and independently disclose, oh, I think I know who did this, and they've been texting me a lot, and I'm getting weird packages in the mail. I think they're sending them. And my email's acting weird. I think they might have hacked in there. They may or may not just automatically share that because, like, oh, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about this incident. But it needs to be what we're talking about because it's letting you know, oh, this is not an isolated incident. This is part of a bigger pattern of behavior. This could actually be a stalking case. Another challenge here is that often different behaviors are reported to different responders. And so victim services knows something, law enforcement knows something over the county line, they got a different report, mental health knows something else, and no one's connecting the dots and saying, oh, this is all the same offender, the same victim. This might be a stalking case. So, stalking is a pattern of behavior, two or more, and it's directed at a specific person or persons. So, in that first scenario where someone's peering in the women's locker room, if they're doing that just to watch whoever happened to be in there at the time undress, that might still be a crime, but that's not really stalking because stalking's directed at someone specific. Now, it could totally become stalking. Let's say they identify a certain woman in there, follow her out, and contact her. Now it is directed at a specific person, and now we have two or more incidents, right? So it could be part of a course of conduct, but that on its own wouldn't really be because stalking is targeted at someone specific. That being said, we often see what we call target dispersion, which is maybe you have a stalker who's targeting, say, their ex-partner. Ex-partner starts dating someone new. Okay, so now they're stalking their ex and the ex's new romantic interest, right? And we know our stalkers are trying to get access to and information about their victims. So they're likely to reach out to the victims' networks, their family, friends, neighbors, colleagues, and others, right? And so a lot of folks can be involved and even considered co-victimized in a stalking case. But we still see that behaviorally as directed at a specific person because our offender is trying to get to that victim and they might use other people to do it. Um, and it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really important to understanding stalking, and it's actually what separates stalking from a victimization it's often confused with, which is harassment. So harassment is typically that repeated behavior that would make someone feel frustrated, angry, annoyed, create a hostile environment. And harassment can be quite serious. I'm not trying to minimize it in any way, but it's not necessarily scary. So if my supervisor is emailing me at 3 a.m. and then yelling at me, calling me names in front of the staff at 9 a.m., like she's terrible and I hate her, I'm not necessarily afraid of her. I can more or less live a normal life, right? But I'm like, ugh, I deserve to be treated better than this. Like, this is not okay. But let's say that I'm driving home. I think I see her car a couple back. She texts me a picture of myself walking my pug, says, why are you doing that instead of working? She emails my husband. I don't know how she got his email. Now I'm scared, right? Because I'm like, wow, what part of my life is separate from or safe from her? Um, she is everywhere. Is she going to hurt me or something? And so harassment can be part of a stalking course of conduct or kind of become stalking. And it might even be the more strategic charge, depending where you're located in the situation. But behaviorally, they are a little bit distinct. I think that's important for a couple of reasons. One is that stalking, when the charges do line up, stalking is typically a higher charge than harassment. So we want to have that accountability. And the other is that our victims of stalking are at greater risk of violence and other harms than our harassment victims. So we want to name that and have the right urgency and connect them to the right safety planning. So again, that stalking is about fear, but fear of what? Right. And so our behavioral definition includes fear of bodily harm, right, for safety or safety of others, as well as substantial emotional distress. So, emotional distress is also about fear. It's just recognizing that fear may be in place of or in addition, you might be afraid of outcomes in place of or in addition to physical harm, right? You might be afraid of losing custody of your children or of an intimate photo being released that'll ruin your reputation forever, or of never having a safe or private moment again. And so emotional distress is not just feeling frustrated or annoyed or having a bad day. It's really feeling that you cannot live a normal life because of the interference from the stalker. So people experiencing emotional distress often feel that they're under surveillance, their life is being invaded, that they're being sabotaged, that they're being intimidated. The best quote that I saw about it was a victim who said, "It's like he's taken my life without killing me." So, for example, of those three scenarios, I'd say the most likely to be stalking would be that second one, the spreading vicious rumors. And you might be thinking, like, well, people gossip. That's not necessarily stalking. And you're right. But we see some really sabotaging and scary rumors. For example, there was a case where the offender um, had figured out the victim's email password, and so without her knowledge or consent was, in her email watching everything she sent and received, and she was applying to jobs. So she's, sending her cover letter and resume to a bunch of different HR offices. Um, and so he created some nude images of her using AI technology, wrote a bunch of lies about what she liked sexually. Every time she'd apply to a job, he would then follow up to that potential employer with those images and those sexual rumors. He then went on LinkedIn, found all the potential colleagues, and would do the same. So that's beyond like, oh, people gossip, or that sounds frustrating, right? That's really scary. This person cannot live a normal life. She is being approached in a sexual way and doesn't know why. She can't provide for her family. And so when I see a case like that, to me, that speaks more to stalking and fear. And that's what that kind of says to me. But fear is a tough concept, right? Because fear is very personal. What's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. So we're gonna watch, this is literally a 5-second video, and think about which of these folks you identify with more. Yep, that's it. So some of you might have felt like the lady in this video, in which case, I'm sorry I did this to you. Someone the other day was like, "Where was the trauma warning on the spider?" So I'm sorry if that's what happened. Um, some of you might feel like this guy, this like, can you calm it down, lady? Some of you might be the spider. I don't know. I don't know what group I'm getting today. But this face left here on the screen might be resonating with you, especially folks on this call who have dealt with a lot of difficult and violent things, right? It's like, it's this, we can understand where this guy's coming from. Like, it's this tiny spider, this lady's losing her mind. Can you calm it down? But what if I told you the same woman was bit by a spider last year that looked just like that, had a terrible allergic reaction, went to the hospital, and almost died? Will we still be making this face at her? Hopefully not, right? Because what did I give you there? Context, information, the backstory. And context is critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in a stalking case because often what's scariest to a victim or survivor may seem benign or even kind of nice to an outsider. For example, this was a case where the victim called law enforcement, and honestly, she was hysterical. She's yelling, she's screaming, she's crying, and all she'd say was, "There's a cup of coffee in my car." So, understandably, police are not sending out the SWAT team. They're kind of like, "Okay, lady," right? And eventually she calmed down enough and said, "He's here." So it turned out it was a stalking survivor who had relocated to get away from the offender, address confidentiality, got off social media, relocated, new job, really thought she'd covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that day. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with his old nickname for her on it. So I can't see y'all since we're on webinar, but typically when I tell that story in person, people are like, ugh, right? Or like, mm-mm. And what that tells me is a reasonable person would feel fear. It's really scary when you know the whole story. But if all you see is this object of a cup of coffee in the car, we're like, dude, I wish my car did that. Why are you upset? Right? It doesn't make any sense. And so that context is critical in stalking cases. Something may be scary to the victim, but not to you as the responder. And so what you want to do is respectfully ask them some follow-up questions. Ask questions like, what message did that send to you? What is the story behind that? Because these behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. The classic, albeit an extreme example, is an offender saying something like, "I'll send you roses the day I kill you." So the victim gets flowers, is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying, "Oh, that's so lovely," because they don't know about that specific meaning. And so it's context that makes stalking scary, and it's context that makes stalking stalking because generally no one thing is stalking, right? It has to be that context of what else is going on, how are these behaviors adding up and relating to each other. Um, and it's criminalizing otherwise non-criminal behaviors. It's not generally a crime to send someone roses. It generally is a crime to make a credible threat to kill somebody. So when one means the other, we have to do some digging and explaining because this is how stalkers so often get away with their behaviors. They threaten their victims in ways that our victims receive loud and clear, but to an outsider without a little bit more understanding of the context, it just flowers aren't threats. Well, no, not always, but they can be. It depends on the context, right? The reality is, if a victim's afraid or in distress, even if you're like, "Ooh, I am trying to be sympathetic, empathetic here, but I just don't get what they're so upset about," they probably know something you don't, right? There's probably something they haven't been able to reveal yet. So we're going to watch the next few seconds of this video. So one more spider sighting, and see how it plays out. All right. Obviously a very silly video, but we don't want to be that guy, right? And this happens in our stalking cases all the time. We have a victim in a lot of fear and distress who has accurately assessed the level of risk, and a responder who is minimizing it, saying you're overreacting, it's not that big a deal. The truth is there's no better risk assessment than a victim's own fear. If a victim's afraid or in distress, even if it's not apparent why, they probably know something you don't. There's probably something we haven't been able to figure out yet. But is it fear? So in the video, we can tell that lady's scared because she's jumping and screaming on the couch. But as y'all already know from your work with survivors, that's not always how victims present, right? We know that people respond to trauma differently. Some might seem really angry or really sad or have a really flat affect or be making jokes about the whole thing. It doesn't mean that it's not traumatic and that they're not scared. And speaking of scared, it's a pretty vulnerable thing to say, I'm feeling scared. I'm feeling afraid. Most of us are more likely to mask that under something else. Like, I'm annoyed, I'm worried about, this is making me really angry, I'm concerned with, I'm frustrated. Um, so most victims are not going to use the words fear or stalking, right? They're more likely to say something like, my ex is being creepy. An old friend is making things awkward. My boss is doing too much. A neighbor's harassing me, right? And it's up to us to be thinking, could this be fear? Could this be stalking? Another thing that can be make it this challenging is that minimization that y'all mentioned earlier, right? Um, a lot of victims, the way they talk about what they're experiencing, they kind of have normalized what to most of us would be quite scary. So, for example, this law enforcement officer shared the story with me. They were the regular point of contact for a stalking survivor. They call to check in. Victim's in a really good mood. And she said, today's a great day. He's only driven by my house 10 times. And the officer's like, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. It's 9 in the morning. And she said, oh, but usually by this point, he's driven by like 25 times. So I think it's going to be a low key day. So it's not that this victim's unreasonable, right? But she is responding to repeated trauma by normalizing what to most of us would be really scary. And that's where behaviorally that reasonable person standard is kind of helpful because if your victim's saying, oh no, it's fine that they're in all my accounts and they follow me everywhere and send me photos of myself as long as they don't bother my kids, right? You kind of take a step back and be like, is it fine? Or maybe is there some minimization happening because of this repeated trauma? Another helpful way to assess for fear is to ask victims what they've changed as a result of the stalking behavior. Because I've had victims say, I'm not afraid of them. It's just annoying. It's stupid, whatever. But like, I left their photo of front desk security at my apartment in my workplace. Oh, I asked my workplace to like take my photo off the website and I switched my shifts because it was much worse when I worked the night shifts and they'd like always show up. I changed my routes to and from work and school. I bought some pepper spray just in case. Oh, and I got one of those doorbells with a camera in case they come to the house. Okay, so those aren't things you do when someone's kind of annoying you, right? That indicates a higher level of fear or distress. And I'm not saying victims should or should not make these changes. I'm simply saying many do, and it's an indicator of fear that this is affecting their lives. And so ask about these accommodations. This is evidence of fear and distress. Have they changed accounts numbers and settings? They stopped using Snapchat. They blocked them on Instagram. They changed their phone number. They turned their location off. Finances on devices or accommodations that could be, buying a new security system or changing the locks. Or, I was going home, I saw them parked outside my house, so I stayed at a motel and here's the receipt, right? Increased security or privacy measures. And often witnesses can corroborate those. Like we had one time a daycare saying, we never used to hear from this mom. Now she calls 3 times a week and says, make sure no one else picks up my kid. That is an increased security measure that is indicating fear. That could also be those behavioral changes like, oh, I used to take public transit, but now I'll only take private because they'd wait for me on the subway. Or I changed my routes. I changed the time I go places. I go to a grocery store 2 towns over so that I don't run into them, that kind of thing. And financial impacts, because most of us get why those are distressing, right? It could be identity theft or financial abuse that often just happens, not just, but that often happens as part of a stalking case. But it could also be employment consequences because they had to spend the time getting a protective order or because the offender sabotaged them in the workplace, which is really common, or replacing damaged property that the stalker damaged. So all of this can be indicators of fear. So when we think about the behavioral definition, there's actually no intent requirement. But something that you'll have in common in your different statutes is that there will be some level of intent we'll need to show. We need to show that our offender knew or should have known what they were doing was scary. And of course, our offenders will say, "Oh, I wasn't trying to scare them. I just sent those death threats, so I thought it was hilarious or whatever." So we have to show, no, you knew or should have known it was scary. There's different ways to do that. One tool that can be helpful is this kind of warning or notice to the respondent. And here you want to use the language, "You are making the victim afraid," and record and document this, because if you have a, recorded, documented notice to the offender saying you are scaring the victim, stop, and then they continue, it's pretty hard for them to argue, "Oh, I didn't know. I didn't realize I was scaring them. I didn't mean to." It's like, "But you did know because we told you and we have that documented." Um, so from a criminal justice perspective, this can be really helpful. Now, the challenge here is, of course, this can escalate our risk to the victim, just like serving a protective order or charging the offender, right? Our stalker might become really angry. "You're telling people about this, you're getting me in trouble," and escalate the behavior. And so you really want to ask victims how they think the stalker will react. Some will say, "Ooh, this will help a lot," because they are going to be so embarrassed getting that knock on the door from law enforcement. They don't want their husband, their wife, their neighbors to know. They don't want to lose their job. Like, they're going to back way off. Great. And some might say, "This will make them really angry, and I'm very scared to do that." Okay, we want to know that too. So it's not an always or a never, but it's something to consider. I do just want to add that no statute requires this. And there's other ways to show intent, right? If our victim has blocked the offender and the offender keeps finding other ways to contact them, that shows resistance and persistence, and I would argue that shows intent, right? They can see that this person doesn't want to talk to them and they're finding ways around it. And so, again, this is just one tool to consider. And for our legal folks, our Equitas attorneys have some great advice on proving intent in stalking cases. So definitely reach out to them. All right, so that's our behavioral definition with a little nod to, to some of the legal requirements there. Um, so stalking prevalence. Stalking is an extremely prevalent victimization. In the United States, nearly 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men experience stalking in their lifetimes. And so the prevalence is right up there with domestic violence and sexual assault, and yet again, very few resources, very little training on this. Now, all kinds of people experience stalking, absolutely. We know that women are more likely than men to be stalked, and the majority of victims report the offender's male. That's regardless of the victim's sexual orientation. That's true overwhelmingly for our female victims. Over 80% of the time, their offender's male. But it's also true about half the time for male victims, about half the time their offender's male. So what's going on there? Why are men stalking other men? Well, some of it might be an extension of power and control from a same-sex relationship, and I'll talk about that intersection in more depth in a couple minutes. And some of it's that target dispersion I mentioned earlier. So say you have an ex-husband stalking an ex-wife, and then she gets a new boyfriend. Okay, so now he's stalking the ex-wife and the new boyfriend as well. That's not the totality of men stalking other men, but that is a big piece of it. So when I look for pictures of stalking, which I do because I'm fun, okay, this is the kind of stuff I get. So let me know in the chat, what do you notice about these photos? What does this say about who stalkers are? Strangers, I agree. Yeah, someone you don't know. They're masked, they're anonymous, right? You get a lot of these kind of unknown, anonymous creepers in the alley, right? Often hiding their identities. Yeah, there's a lot of mask, a lot of facelessness, a lot of hoodies. Yeah, a lot of hoodies and masks and facelessness. And yeah, it'd be a lot easier to identify stalkers and be like, "Oh, it's probably that guy who doesn't have a face," right? It's like, no, usually stalkers do have faces, actually. Yeah, it's only showing males, even though anyone can be a stalker, absolutely. And a lot of physically following. If you look at the locations, you get a lot of kind of like alleyways, tunnels. This looks very similar to the myth of the stranger rapist, if you're familiar with that, right? That sense of it's kind of these random creepers in the alley. And I'm sure it won't surprise you at all on this call to know that this is not accurate, right? That usually victims know stalkers, stalkers know victims. So I know you know that already. The reason I bring this up is because most folks do not know that. When I'm talking about stalking outside of our field, because I'm fun at parties and stuff, okay? People are shocked by this because when most people think stalking, this is what they're thinking of. They're thinking about like some hooded anonymous figure, or they might be thinking about like an obsessed fan with a significant mental health issues stalking a celebrity, right? Someone kind of delusional because that's a lot of the stalking news that we see is that celebrity news. Or they might be thinking about a stranger, like a secret admirer, sending a ransom style note because that's a pretty common trope on TV. And all those things can and do occur, but they're by far the minority of cases. And so the challenge is you have victims saying things like, oh, that's not a stalker. That's just my ex having a hard time getting over things. Well, again, surprising zero people here, that's a major category of stalking offender, right? So over 40% of the time for our female victims, about a third of the time for our male victims, the stalker is a current or former intimate partner. It's an extension of power and control from an abusive relationship, and I'll talk about that intersection in more depth in a little bit. So that's a big piece of it, right? And especially as we think about it being Domestic Violence Month, though of course it's relevant all year round, that intersection, that stalking is often related to intimate partner violence. So that's a big piece of it, right? 30, 40%. But I also want to make the point pretty strongly that if, okay, 30, 40% of the time it's an intimate partner, that means 60 to 70% of the time it is not an intimate partner. It might be an acquaintance. It could be a stranger, though it's relatively rare. It might be a brief encounter, like, oh, I think they work at that coffee shop, or I met them at my friend's party. Like, I kind of recognize them, but I don't really know them. It could be a family member or a person of authority, supervisor, academic advisor, some kind of legal officer, someone with some kind of power over the victim. So I encourage you to think about in your services and with your partners and the survivors that you serve, are you reaching and serving all survivors of stalking, intimate partner and not? Um, do you know where to refer them if you don't have that capacity? And if you are serving them, that's great, but how would they find you? Because again, if I'm being stalked by, say, an estranged friend and there was never a sexual or romantic relationship, it's not very intuitive for me to look for my local family justice center or domestic violence or rape crisis. Yet that's where the victim services are that can help me the most, right? And so thinking about things like, is the word stalking on your website? Do you participate in Stalking Awareness Month to the degree that you do for October and April? Um, are your staff trained on stalking? Do you like? Do you have clear policies on if someone experiencing non-intimate partner stalking can come into shelter? Right. And so we have a checklist of fun questions like that. So you can be the most popular person at your next staff meeting. But we have slightly different questions for victim services, for law enforcement, and for campus. And some of these honestly are pretty low-hanging fruit, just like if serving stalking victims is part of your mission, then maybe put it in your mission statement, right? And some of them are harder, like what resources, what services do you have? Are your staff trained on stalking? Are you screening all survivors for stalking, etc.? And so I won't say this is easy to do because, again, y'all are already busy and have plenty of work going on. But I will say we try to make it as easy as possible at Spark. So if we're saying, hey, you should really have a brochure, if you have one for domestic and sexual violence, you should have a stalking one. We have it. You can order it from us for free. If we're saying you should screen survivors, all survivors for stalking, we have the screening questions, right? If we're saying include stalking and awareness materials, we have the programs you can pick up and lead. That being said, it's all easier said than done, and there's more work to be done. So don't hesitate to contact us with, "Hey, I'm trying to enhance my services in this way, and I don't have the right tool." Let us know, right? Because that's what we're here for, to help make it as doable as possible. So stalking behaviors. I don't mean this as a compliment to stalkers, but stalkers are very creative offenders. People always tell me their most bizarre, disturbing cases are stalking cases because behaviorally, it is about going out of your way to scare someone. That is literally the whole point, right? So, like I read a case where an offender drove 300 miles to carve his ex's name in trees near her new home. That's a stalking case. I've seen a lot of dead animals in the male cases. Those are stalking cases. These like, ew, why? Can you do anything else with your time on this earth? those are stalking cases. And so, because stalkers are creative, we have to be creative and broad-minded in identifying what some of those behaviors are and thinking, huh, could this be part of a stalking course of conduct? One common stalker tactic is this kind of crazy making behavior. So, a stalker might break into a victim's vehicle or residence and not take or break anything, but just leave some sign they've been there. So, maybe they leave a can of soda, that's the brand that the victim knows that stalker likes to drink. Or they move a lamp they one time argued about where it should go. Or they turn the TV on a channel they used to watch together. And so the victim gets, let's say, home. They know that offender has been there, but they're like, what am I going to do? Call the police and say someone moved a lamp? I'm going to sound crazy. And stalkers know that. That's why they engage in this behavior. In fact, a little under 1 in 5 victims reported this exact thing, offender breaking into home or vehicle and just leaving a sign they had done so. And so if victim ever says to you, I know it sounds crazy, but that's a red flag. This might be a stalking case. And I always tell law enforcement, I'm not saying don't investigate it, but I'm saying let's investigate it. If our victim's saying, I hear voices, well, it's pretty easy to drop in on an Alexa or a Google Home or on, an easy or cameras that have microphone capability that you can access remotely. These things really are quite possible, and I think it's tempting and hopeful to say, well, I don't think someone would work that hard just to be creepy and terrible. But unfortunately, stalkers do and would and will, and so we have to recognize that and really consider these behaviors. There are so many stalking behaviors. We certainly don't have time to talk about them all, but I think this is a really helpful framework. It's by this wonderful researcher, TK Logan, and it helps to just kind of broaden our thinking on stalking. And these categories overlap and intersect, and that's fine. It's just to kind of think a little more broadly, because when a lot of folks think stalking, they think surveillance. So you often get imagery of like binoculars or, a shadow in the window, or you might have heard about like property trackers on vehicles. And surveillance is often part of a stalking case, but it's not the only thing because anything scary that's not the first thing that happened could be a stalking case. And that's really a wide variety of behaviors. And so I'm going to go through these categories and a few examples of each, and please feel free to share your own examples in the chat as well. So surveillance is pretty much what it sounds like. How is a stalker tracking, following, watching, gathering information about that victim? That could be using technology, like say they plant a tracker on the victim's vehicle, or they access something the victim's already using, right? Let's say our victim got a doorbell with a camera so they can see if the offender comes to the home. That can be a really great protective tool unless our offender gets access to it. Now they're the one watching, right? So it could be planting something new or accessing that our victim's already using. Um, it could be just watching what they post on social media or where their location and following them. But that technology piece is important, and we do training on the use of technology to stalk. But I also want to point out that most stalkers who use technology are also stalking in person. So good old-fashioned going through the mail, going through the trash, driving by the home, following on foot, as well as proxy stalking, which is a fancy way of saying stalking through third parties. So maybe it's just asking that mutual friend, hey, what are their Halloween plans? Are they going to that party? Right? Or asking at the bar, they're my favorite bartender. When's their next shift so I can come back and be here when they're working and bring my friends? And so that third party might have no idea they're helping a stalker by giving that information. Or sometimes those third parties totally know they're helping a stalker. So we see offenders continue to offend even when incarcerated because they might send someone, you go check up on them for me, send this message, take a picture and send it to me, etc. And so we often see stalkers using those third parties. So that's surveillance. Life invasion. How is the stalker showing up in the victim's life where the victim doesn't want them to be there? So they're just trying to get through their day, and there's the stalker or signs of the stalker no matter what they do. We see that most frequently through unwanted contact. Most of us have our phones with us all day, so it's across applications, it's across platforms, right? They're texting, they're calling, they're leaving voicemails, they're commenting, upvoting, downvoting, they're in WhatsApp, they're on Snapchat, they're on Facebook. You sit down to do your job, they're in your work email, just this constant trying to get to you, trying to get to you, trying to get to you. That can also include showing up in person, and there's a lot of that. Like, since when do you go to this grocery store? Since when do you come to our kids' soccer game, right? But finding excuses to be in public or semi-public places, as well as leaving items or gifts or notes or mail. It can also be that public humiliation, right? You walk into a room and, ooh, everyone just saw those images, etc. It feels very invasive. And harassing friends and family. And so many victims say, hey, when it was just me, it was fine. But now that they're calling my parents, my friends, my new partner, my boss, like it's really not okay. So that sense of no matter where I go, there's signs of this person or this actual person is showing up. Intimidation, that could be explicit or implicit, right? We do see those explicit threats that I will harm you, I'll do this to you, I'll do that to you. Um, it could also be symbolic violence, like a threatening gesture or a crushed can. Or we had a case where a stalker kept breaking into the victim's home and slicing her underwear with a knife. So that kind of symbolic sexual violence. It could be forced confrontations, like they're just standing right in front of the car or they're standing outside the apartment building. So if I want to leave, I'd have to sort of go through them and confront them physically. And it could be threats of violence as well as threats to, say, share an intimate image or to disclose personal information or to sabotage them some other way. It could be a threat to harm themselves. That's really scary for our victims, as well as threats about harming others, family, friends, pets, etc. And I just want to point out that with these, sometimes there's, I think, a really high threshold for what counts as a threat, like legally, when I hear folks interpreting it. But really just think about how all the behaviors I mentioned could be intimidating, really. I mean, if you leave the webinar today and you got a text message from unknown number that said, hope you liked that webinar, and then described to you what you were wearing, and then described where you were going, wouldn't you be intimidated? I'd be pretty scared, even if it didn't say, and I will physically harm you, right? And so all of these things can absolutely be intimidating and imply further harm. And interference through sabotage or attack, what's actually changing for this victim? How are they being, how is their life being tampered with? How are they being harmed? So that could be financial and work sabotage, anything from calling the boss and saying, guess you gave me terrible customer service, to tampering with finances directly and moving money around. It could be those, again, reputation, intimate images, etc., spreading rumors, custody interference, and we often see misusing the court system and child welfare system to antagonize and further stalk victims, right? Keeping them from leaving, of course, physical violence, right? Harming that person, as well as property damage, very tangible interference. Well, they slashed my tire, I can't get to work, that interferes with my day. Um, and so all of these can, as well as interference like, oh, they changed my passwords on all my accounts. Now I can't access it. That interferes with my ability to do my daily life. And so there's really, again, a wide variety of these behaviors. And again, these overlap and intersect, but they're important to note because typically, if you ask a victim, are you being stalked? They're likely to be like, no, it's not stalking, calm down. But if you ask about these more specific behaviors, you're likely to get more information. So ask about these categories. Surveillance, have they been tracking, following, or monitoring you in any way? And give some examples of what that might look like. Like, are they showing up places that they usually wouldn't be? Have you seen them following you when you drive around? You know, invading life invasion. Have they invaded your life or privacy with unwanted contact? And your victim might say, well, I don't know if they've invaded my life, but I mean, they text me all the time. Look, they're texting me right now, right? So you're likely to get more information there. And so ask about these categories. And if they say yes, ask, were you afraid for your safety or the safety of others? Because that's what stalking's about. It's about that fear. Did you make life changes for those reasons? Those are those accommodations I mentioned earlier, right? Oh, I changed my phone number. I took time off work. And were you worried about financial or social impact? That speaks more to the emotional distress piece. And so this is kind of the quick way to, relatively quick way to screen for stalking. That's going to give you more information than just are you being stalked? I'll come back to this, I promise. We also have this checklist. It says for law enforcement, but really for anyone, of some of the most common stalking behaviors. So this goes by category. It includes, you know, here's the big category question and then some examples, and reminds folks, hey, this could be in person, online, through third parties, etc. And so this is a nice way to screen and to ask folks about the stalking they're experiencing or may be experiencing. There is also a risk assessment specific to stalking that's based on these four categories. And so it will ask those four questions and then more. So It's called the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile, or SHARP. It is free. It's online. You can get to it from our website or from coercivecontrol.org. It's great because it basically just asks, has this happened? Has that happened? Are you worried about this? Are you worried about the why? Let's get some information about the offender if you know it. And then it creates a narrative report and risk profile. And so we don't have time to go through this in detail today, but just to show you kind of a little excerpt of what it looks like. It's short, it's two or three pages. It chunks out the information. And then it's going to let you it's looking at 14 risk factors, and it'll let you know based on what you shared how many there are. So in this case, we have 12 out of the 14. Then it tells you what it's happening, right? Like why those are risk factors. It also creates some safety planning suggestions, which doesn't replace your individualized planning with a victim advocate, but can be a really good place to start. I've seen victim advocates print that out and then use that just as a starting point for safety planning. And so it's really helpful. Again, it's free, and you can just click, I'm testing this out before you're sitting across from a survivor. But we really highly recommend it for a few reasons. One is that it makes what's going on very tangible. It's here in black and white. You know, it feels like a more formal assessment than just someone being worried about you. Um, it condenses the information and makes it easier to explain and kind of tell the story of what's happening. So I've seen folks use it to help them explain why they need a protective order, and or with victim confidentiality and privacy in mind to collaborate, right? Let's get people on the same page. Here's, long story short, what's happening with this victim. And so, and also it can often validate our victims' fears and concerns, because there it is again, right there in black and white, and help us recognize the full course of conduct with questions that we may not think to ask. And so I really highly recommend it as a tool. We have more resources as well on identifying stalking, including on calls for service, thinking through those behaviors, and also lists of what different stalking behaviors might look like in different populations. And so definitely check all those out. Now, there are, again, so many stalking behaviors, and most stalkers are using more than one. So they're not just texting, they're not just showing up, they're doing a variety of the different tactics I mentioned and more. Um, and most pursue their victims at least once a week. Many pursue daily. And the average duration of a stalking case, this really shocked me when I learned this, not the high end. The average duration of a stalking case is 2 years, and 10% of cases last 5 years or more. And so a stalking case can last from one afternoon to an entire lifetime, right? There's a huge variety there. But for a lot of our for a lot of our stalkers, unfortunately, they have time. They have time to change their tactics. And so what that means is that while no, we can't read the future, we want to be thinking about not only what has the stalker already done, but what might they do next? What access or information does the stalker have about this victim? Because just because they haven't, say, come to the home yet, doesn't mean they won't. So maybe let's have a safety plan in place where they have a bag packed and a safe exit and a safe place to go. And maybe we want to install a camera so we can catch the suspect doing it, right? And so it's also important to recognize that our safety planning and risk assessment is only capturing one moment in time. These cases are dynamic. The situation might look different next week, next month, next year. And so that safety planning and risk assessment needs to be an ongoing process that is responsive to changes in the case over time. So co-victimizations here. Um, Stalking, like I said, often relates to domestic violence. Around 30–40% of the time, that stalker is a current or former intimate partner. So I want to focus more on that intersection here. So if you look at our friend, the power and control wheel, which my guess is you've seen before, of course, this is highlighting how abusers use power to control their victims. And I show this to you because um, often when folks talk about stalking and domestic violence, if they do it all, they usually say something like this. They'll say something like, okay, it was an abusive relationship, the victim left, and from the day that victim left, our abuser began stalking them. And that can happen, absolutely. But let's take a step back. If during the relationship, our abuser is showing up at work, showing up at school, showing up at the gym, asking friends and family where they are, putting a tracker on the vehicle to contact him, count remotely, that's stalking, right? It's intimate partner violence. It's what we might call digital abuse or emotional abuse. And it's stalking. It's both. And it can happen during and or after a relationship ends. Over half the time it's happening during the relationship as well. But typically victims and responders don't call it stalking then. They call it again emotional abuse, digital abuse, coercive control. And it is those things, but it's also stalking. Um, and we want to know when stalking's happening at any point in an intimate partner violence relationship because while all stalkers can be dangerous, absolutely, on average, our intimate partner stalkers are the most violent and threatening towards their victims. So you can tell me in the chat why. Why do you think an intimate partner stalker would be more threatening on average than, say, a stranger or a brief encounter? Um, why do you think they can do more harm generally? They know you. Yeah, they know more about you. They know you better and they have greater access. Absolutely. They know things that are very practical to stalk, right? Like I know their passwords, I know their family's phone number so I can call and say I'm so worried I haven't heard from them. I know their routine and their schedule and their coworkers and where they live and where they, the coffee shop they like to go. And they also know what will uniquely scare that victim, which is what stalking is often all about, right? So, if you hated the spider in that video earlier, guess who would have known that? Your intimate partner. And so when it's time to stalk you, it's spider time. It's not spider time for me. They're coming for my pug, right? That's what you care about, what will uniquely scare you. And so it's the people who know how to get to us and know how to get to us, right? Who are often the most dangerous and threatening, as well as that sense of entitlement and that commitment to the course of conduct. And so, generally, the closer someone is or was to the victim, the more access and knowledge that they have about that person, and the more threatening and violent they tend to be. So, you see that follow in these categories here. That being said, all stalkers can be dangerous, and I wouldn't get too hung up on these categories. And here's what I mean by that. Like, no one uses the term intimate partner besides us, right? No one's like, oh, come over for brunch. You have to meet my new intimate partner. Like no one's ever said that. And we have a lot of relationships that are, oh, we met on a dating app, but we didn't really hit it off romantically, so we're just friends now. Or we're mostly friends, but we hooked up a couple times. Okay, is that an intimate partner or an acquaintance? Honestly, I don't really care. I care about what access to and information about this victim does our offender have, and how committed do they seem to be to the course of conduct. So I think those are the really salient factors, and it just makes sense that they tend to follow these patterns here. Our intimate partner stalkers are the most likely to approach in person, be interfering and threatening, use weapons, and to reoffend. This is a study of women with protective orders. So all have been abused, all have protective orders. Some of the women were abused and stalked. The women abused and stalked had higher rates of all the harms here across the board, verbal abuse and degradation to physical violence, and sexual assault, threat with weapon, attack with a weapon, and injury. So again, when there was abuse and stalking, higher rates of all of these different victimizations, and the homicide connection I mentioned right at the top today. Stalking is a lethality risk. It's one of the top 10 risk factors for intimate partner homicide. It's a threefold increase in risk. And so when we see stalking with intimate partner violence, that should be a red flag that this offender might be particularly dangerous and that this victim might be at risk for a variety of other harms, including homicide. If we just call it emotional abuse or digital abuse and don't name the stalking, we miss that, right? We miss those indicators. Stalking can also intersect with sexual violence a few different ways. One, just to realize the co-victimization here. This is a survey of young adults who identified as sexual assault survivors ages 18 to 24, and it simply asked them, have you experienced stalking as well? Nearly half are saying yes. And so we know that all too often these victimizations go hand in hand. This can happen a few different ways. Um, our stalker might be threatening sexual violence, right? Their intimidation is of a sexual nature. They're making sexual threats, Or they might be engaging in surveillance because they're planning to be sexually violent towards that victim. They're trying to assess how vulnerable this is this person, when can I access them, when are they alone, right? Because they're trying to plan a sexual assault. They might try to get a third party to assault the victim. And so, unfortunately, we see this increasingly through impersonation online. So, our stalker might say, make a fake dating profile for the victim and then pretending to be the victim, be messaging dates. And because they're also engaging in surveillance, they're then sending those dates to the victim in person. And so these strangers show up to the victim and say, I'm here for what we talked about. And the victim's like, I'm not even on that app. What are you talking about? Right. And so you can see where that could lead from anything from, frustration and ruining reputation all the way up to sexual violence. And unfortunately, it has. Um, the stalker might sexually assault the victim at any point in the course of conduct, or sometimes the stalking begins after sexual violence to intimidate that victim out of reporting or to increase the trauma of the assault. For example, there was a case where a stalker had sexually assaulted the victim using an object and then kept mailing the victim that object. So it kind of becomes a stalking case at that point. Or that, you better not tell anyone, or if you tell anyone, it's different threats, right? Then it can become stalking. So stalking for sexual violence can look really obviously scary, like sending an object that was used for sexual penetration, or it can look something more like this. So this kind of grooming behavior, right? And so there are different kinds of sexually violent offenders, but there are those repeat rapists who tend to have the same MO. And I'm summarizing, but basically this is what they're going to do. They're going to research and identify vulnerable victims. So that could be our upperclassmen looking for say undergraduate freshman women who don't seem to have a lot of drinking or partying experience, who seem naive. It might be our child sexual predator looking for a child who seems neglected or lonely, who is not supervised. They're going to establish a relationship through multiple contacts and build trust. You seem really mature for your age. I understand you so much better than your parents do, right? So building that relationship. If they haven't yet, they're going to meet in person and isolate the victim. That could be come to this party, plying that victim with alcohol, and then separating them to commit an assault. It could be let's come over and take some pictures in the basement, coerce them into sexual violence, and then contact them after, either to say thanks for a great time, or you better not tell anyone, or some conflation of the two. So I encourage you to think about that through the lens of stalking. Is it a pattern of behavior? Yeah. It's more than one contact, right? Is it directed at a specific person? Yeah. Our offenders are often choosing victims based on their perceived vulnerability and lack of credibility. And would it cause a reasonable person to feel fear? Well, yeah, we're afraid of sexual violence. But you might be thinking, okay, but when though? Because our victim might say, well, I wasn't scared when they sent me that text message saying I was mature for my age, right? I was flattered. Um, but there's no statute that says when fear has to attach. So a victim's looking back and saying, at the time, I thought it was really cool, but now I realize the whole thing was a setup for my rape and it started with that text message. That could still be a stalking case. Again, there's no statute that says when fear has to attach, and later actions can reframe how we look at earlier events. And so I mention this because sometimes our sexual assault cases come down to this moment of consent or non-consent, and our offender might be really happy to show you, no, we have this whole relationship. But looking at that through the lens of grooming and stalking can tell a really different story. Again, the co-occurring victimizations here. This was a survey of undergraduate students stalked by an intimate partner, and it found that nearly 1 in 3 were sexually assaulted by that partner, and more than 10% were physically assaulted. And this is that same study of women with protective orders. So all have been abused, all have protective orders. Some were abused and stalked. The women abused and stalked at higher rates, not only of penetrative rape itself, but also these other kinds of sexual violence, like implicit threats and force, verbal pressure, degradation, coercion, right? Um, so again, when there's abuse and stalking, higher rates of all these sexual harms. And so, long story short, too late for you maybe, ask about co-occurring victimizations. Absolutely ask your stalking survivor about intimate partner and sexual violence. But if you're working with a survivor who's primarily presenting as a victim of um, sexual or intimate partner violence, ask them about stalking because often this is missed. And then we don't get the full scope of victimization and harm. And you may be thinking, like, well, I get that you care that I find and call it stalking because you're like the stalking lady, but does it really matter? And unsurprisingly, I will argue it does matter for these reasons. One are our charging and prosecution options. Again, I understand stalking's not always the most strategic charge, but it's not never the most strategic charge, and it's quite undercharged. Most prosecutors like having a menu of options. And also, it can be quite strategic in the right case, and I'll tell you why. Of course, I'm generalizing here, but often if you're charging, say, domestic violence or domestic battery, the court's going to try to limit you to that evening. Did the violence happen? Yes or no, right? But if you're charging stalking, you can bring in the whole course of conduct and paint a much fuller picture of just how terrible this offender is. This is not someone with an anger management issue who snapped one day. This is someone who's been putting the cup of coffee in the car, carving the name in the trees, flowers the day I kill you. And those details and those behaviors haunt me, haunt you, haunt judges and juries as well, and paints a much fuller picture of how terrible this offender is. That can be quite compelling and might be more admissible if you're charging stalking, which is about that pattern of behavior. Safety planning. When you hear stalking, you want to be thinking, okay, surveillance, life invasion, interference, intimidation. I want to figure out the full scope of the course of conduct. I want to think about what access to and information about this victim or offender has. And I might want to use my stalking specific risk assessment. And I want to recognize the increased risk for this victim to experience physical violence, sexual violence, and homicide. If we just call it, say, digital abuse, we miss that indicator and that kind of red flag that we want to be applying this lens and those tools. And victim empowerment, even if victims like, I don't want to do any of that. Like, I'm not going to call the police. I don't want to make a safety plan with you. Even just to be able to articulate instead of my ex is being creepy, to be able to say, I'm being stalked. That's a real thing. And there are resources available, and I can Google it and something comes up. Of course, I hear the word stalking used all the time incorrectly, right? So you might have heard or said something like this, like, I'm totally stalking you on Insta and I saw your photos, right? And I'm certainly not saying that the casual use of the word stalking causes stalking. It doesn't. But I do think it dilutes the seriousness of the term because we're calling it stalking when it's not, and then we are not calling it stalking when it is. And I'd argue it's a little bit unique to the crime of stalking at this point. Like, no one's like, oh man, that party was so lit. It's arson, right? That's not a thing. If you tell your friend there was arson at my apartment, they're going to be like, dude, there was arson? Are you okay? We got to call the police. Are you all right? There was freaking arson. But if you tell your friend, and we know most victims tell friends and family first, right? If you tell your friend, I think it's stalking, you're likely to get this response of like, okay, is it stalking or is it stalking? And that can have a really chilling effect. And if our victims continue to seek services, take this seriously, and get the help that they need. We also see stalking normalized in our media quite a bit. I'm doing a webinar on this later in the month on intimate partner stalking in media, which I think will be really fun. So I hope that you'll join me for that. But here's kind of the quicker version. And it's fine to like what you like. This isn't to like say that any piece of media is the problem. It's just to realize there's a cumulative effect to this misinformation. That we often see stalking shown as romantic. So typically our male protagonists who will stop at nothing to get the girl and they'll just keep going and she's at the airport, but the plane left, so now he's going to France and he finds her, and it usually works and that behavior is rewarded. But it's also often shown as funny. It's a common trope in our sitcoms and cartoons to have that character that's just like, ugh, there they are again. They do not understand boundaries, right? Who just kind of is misguided and doesn't get it and a little bit delusional. So if you think about like SpongeBob will not leave Squidward alone, right? And in those pieces of media, it's played for laughs. It's shown as harmless. Um, or it's shown as heroic, like our superheroes. Our Spider-Man's got to watch over Mary Jane so that he can swoop in and save her if she gets in trouble. Well, what do our offenders say, especially our intimate partner offenders? They often say things like, I trust you, I don't trust the world around you. That's why I have to watch you to keep you safe. It fits right into that sense of surveillance is love, and that stalking is for protection. Or sometimes it's shown as edgy and sexy, like, ooh, they really went there. And I'm like, no, who else is going there? One in three women and one in six men because they are victims of stalking. Now, I like to see stalking in a horror movie, right? I'm like, that is accurate. A stalking is scary. I think it's fine to show it as scary. I think it's a lot more dangerous when we show it as romantic, funny, heroic, etc. And again, no one piece of media is the problem, but there's a cumulative effect. And the combined effect is that it creates this fantasy of stalking. The fantasy is that the stalker is an attractive stranger or like a meet cute or a secret admirer. They have good and pure intentions, usually romantic. At worst, it's like a SpongeBob situation where it's like, ugh, how awkward. They're so misguided. This is so annoying, right? And at best, it's really flattering. And our target is supposed to feel really seen and chosen by this attention. And that's just not the reality of stalking, right? In real life, stalkers are typically people that we know that we want nothing to do with. They want to scare their victims and delight in doing so. They are engaging in a variety of disturbing and violent behaviors, and our victims are terrified. They're relocating, they're changing their names, they're blocking them, right? They're really scared. And so I don't think there's any one reason for the minimization of stalking, but often when I hear people say something like, oh, it's just a stalking case, I think to myself, oh, you're reacting to the fantasy of stalking, not the reality of stalking. And the truth is, at this point, we have a lot of fantasy and not a lot of counterbalance of information with the reality. If you watch an episode of TV that includes, say, sexual assault, usually something pops up at the end that says, hey, if you're experiencing this, call this number. We don't have that for stalking. So we just have the misinformation and no counterbalance of real information, right? The PSA never comes. And so that's why it's up to all of us as responders and educators to kind of be that PSA and say, hey, this fantasy exists and these are the realities about stalking. And we have a lot of tools to help do so. But people really are really learning about stalking from this misinformation and never getting the real information. All right, so I have a few minutes left here, so a couple big picture tactics on responding to victims. Hopefully, I've imparted this to you. If your victim's talking about an incident, zoom out. Is this isolated? Is it part of a bigger course of conduct? Recognize that victims cope with stalking different ways. These are all normal human ways to cope with a stalker, and I'm not putting a value judgment on any of them, but some of them might be more or less effective. And so you want to ask your victim, what have they already done? What's working and what's not working? One piece of advice I want to address is this move away advice. And this is what many victims do, and it's also what a lot of victims are told by responders. So move away is anything that creates distance, right? So they're often told, block the stalker, cease communication, change your phone number, change your routes to and from work, anything that creates that distance. Um, and so let's play that out for a second. So something victims are often told in that vein of move away is log off, change your phone number, etc. So let's say I'm stalking you, and let's say I'm old school. Okay, I like to call you on the phone. So I'm calling, 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 and eventually you're like, I am so over Dana stalking me, I'm gonna change my freaking number. Like I cannot with her. So eventually I call and I get this number is no longer in service. Am I the stalker gonna be like, oh man, I guess I'll stop stalking and become a productive member of society this day? No, I'm already stalking you. I know where you live. I know where you work. I know your email. I know your Instagram handle. I'm just going to find another way to you, and I might escalate my behavior and become less predictable because how dare you? That was my favorite way to stalk you, and you took it away from me. And so, on one hand, the move away advice is good in that any contact reinforces the stalker's behavior, right? If I call 100 times and you pick up and say, Dana, stop it, I hate you, tomorrow I'm calling 101 times because that was a win for me. But cutting off contact may not be realistic or even all that helpful, right? Victims might be engaging in ongoing contact to keep themselves safe, to kind of keep their enemies closer, right? It might be through joint custody or something else. But also, if our victim blocks the offender, maybe the offender can't see them. They also can't see the offender. So they're not going to get that message saying, you've made me so angry, I'm coming over to teach you a lesson. So they know to leave or to call the police. They're not going to see on Instagram, oh, they're out of town this weekend. Maybe I can relax a little bit, right? And a victim put it to me like this, if you're being hunted by somebody, don't you want to know where they are? Kind of hard to argue with that. Also, if you block them, you may not get that evidence if anything does escalate or continue. Um, And so, look, this is messier, right? From a criminal justice perspective, it's a lot cleaner to draw that line in the sand, seize contact, and then if our offender continues, it shows their intent. And so that's helpful information to know. It shows that resistance and persistence. You changed your phone number, Dana found your new one. You blocked Dana, she started emailing. You blocked her on email, she started chatting with you on Instagram, right? It shows my intent and my persistence. But did that make you safer? Maybe, maybe not. And so again, it's really both asking your victim how they think the stalker will react if they do cut them off in certain ways. Some will say, yep, I want to draw that line in the sand. It makes it really clear that it'll be more helpful to pursue the criminal justice piece and it'll send a strong message to them. Great. Some might say, I'm really scared to do that because if they can't reach me, I have no idea what they'll do next and it could get so much worse. Some victims are too afraid to cut the offender out, right? It's again that keep your enemies closer. And so I encourage you to think about that because there's a lot of places where I know the case or the protective order or what have you will be thrown out if they find out the victim contacted the offender. Um, and let's rethink that, as much as we can, because we have victims who are getting like the bottom of the screen all day. The temptation to respond and say, stop it, I hate you is quite strong. It doesn't mean, oh, look, the contact was mutual and they're not afraid. We want to trust our victim instincts. Our safety planning should evolve. I already mentioned that. Consider the stalker's next tactic and how they're going to react to how a victim is reacting or not reacting to what they're doing. And of course, safety planning is always about balancing that safety and freedom, which is easier said than done. But safety planning is typically pretty unfair to victims. It's telling them to make their lives smaller to avoid the stalker when they're the one already being victimized. And so victims are allowed to draw their own boundaries around how private or public their lives are and what they still want to do versus what they're willing to give up, right? And around technology, I see a lot of victim blaming around this. And at the risk of sounding overly twee, I feel like the what did you share has become the new what did you wear, right? Where they'll say, well, if you don't want to be found, don't share your location. Or if you didn't want them to know that you were seeing someone new, why'd you post a picture of you and your new partner, right? But the reality is nothing that a victim shares or does not is a reason for stalking. The reason for stalking is that a stalker saw that information and felt entitled to misuse it to go and terrify that person. And so, just like with sexual assault, we could talk about risk reduction or what have you, but nothing a victim does or doesn't share or do is a reason for the stalking behavior. And so, only victims can draw those lines around privacy and their behavior and etc. And they might change over time, and that's okay. Earlier, I mentioned documentation log. We have these on our website. Very succinct. We often tell victims document, but we don't always tell them what we actually mean by that. And so they might end up saying, "Oh, it was finally a chilly day this fall," and we're like, "Oh no, we're not going to read this journal entry, right?" And so giving them something like this can be helpful. Very succinct, date, time, what happened, where did it happen for those jurisdictional issues I mentioned earlier, as well as if technology was used, what platform, because getting evidence from Snapchat is different than TikTok, is different than Instagram, is different than Google. If there's witnesses, if they've attached evidence, and also educating victims on best ways to save evidence. It's not intuitive, right? That hey, take a screenshot, but when you do that, make sure you slide your thumb over to show the date and time, etc. Those are all things victims can do, but they may not know that. And if they made a report to anyone, victims often don't really understand jurisdiction and or who law enforcement is. So they might say like, I told the police, and you drill down and it's like, you told the bouncer at that club, right? That person could still be a good witness, but it's helpful to see who they make a report to. And so you can assess, okay, who's sharing information, who maybe isn't. And even if they call the same department every time, they might have a different responding officer in a big city, right? And so when that officer gets a call about the cup of coffee, they might kind of roll their eyes. But being able to say, hey, this is just the latest in the course of conduct, and here's all the other times I've called and who I've talked to and what's going on, can be really helpful. This is burdensome for victims. It's a lot of work. It's asking a lot of them. It's not fair, frankly, in my opinion. But it's helpful because these incidents add up, but they only add up if we do the math. And something like this can help that happen. Of course, what we need most of all is that much easier said than done, which is that coordination, right? Because typically when these cases fall through the cracks, it's usually not just one person's fault. It's not like, oh, if that one person had just called it in on time or something. It's usually really a systemic failure because frankly, our system's not set up for stalking. It's set up to be incident based. So we need everyone together on this. We need our awareness educators to make sure our general public knows what stalking is. They take it seriously, that when a friend reports it, they say, hey, that sounds like stalking. That's really serious. And they know where to go for help. We need those helpers, our victim service providers, to identify the stalking and safety plan around it uniquely. We need our law enforcement to charge it. We need our prosecutors to pick up those charges and argue it effectively. We need our courts to sentence it appropriately for the harmful and violent victimization it is. And we need our probation, parole, and corrections folks who are often left out of the conversation to continue to identify those behaviors, hold our offenders accountable, and keep our victims safe. When any of that doesn't happen, we lose victims. And the reality is, after this 90 minutes, y'all now know more about stalking than most people in our field. That is the reality of the situation. And so it kind of has to be you in whatever role that you play saying, I know not everyone gets this, but and sees the urgency here, but I do, and I know better, and helping walk our victims through this imperfect system. A couple of resources to help you do so. Victim Connect is the closest thing we have to a stalking hotline. They'll refer to local resources. And so that's if you're ever sharing like the RAIN hotline, DV hotline, consider sharing Victim Connect as well. National Stalking Awareness Month is in January, everyone's favorite month, only a few months away. We really have everything on our website that you need to make that successful. Everything from posters you can order to daily social media posts, blurbs to put in your newsletter, free webinars to attend, programs to lead, lots of stuff for tabling, all that kinds of stuff. So I hope that you'll get involved. Another great way to get involved, I focused a lot on problems today, right? These are problems, they're not being solved. But we also want to recognize there's some really great work happening around stalking around the country, and we want to hear about it. And so we have an annual award called the Peggy Clinky Award. So if someone that you know is making a positive difference for stalking survivors, this could be victim services, awareness, criminal justice, really a variety of folks, or something else entirely, let us know. We want to honor that person. We also have the brochures and posters I already mentioned on our website, which of course you already know it, you love it. Stalkingawareness.org. Here's my contact information, as well as if you can fill out the training evaluation really quick. That's great to give us some feedback on the training today. This is my contact info. I just want to thank you so much for your attention and for joining today and for all of your good work. I know it's easy for me to sit here and say, hey, think about this, use this tool, consider that, right? But you're the ones actually on the ground, keeping victims safe and holding offenders accountable. It is all easier said than done, and I totally understand and respect that. So truly thank you for the work that you do. And don't hesitate to contact us for further training in person or online. We're usually free of charge for a ton of resources on our website. And for anything else that you might need. So thank you all so much. And I hope that you'll keep in touch with us. All right, I know I'm out of time, so it looks like I don't have time for questions today, but feel free to email me and then I will get back to you. So thank you all so much.